Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and I'm going to be reading a couple of stories by James Thurber, who wrote for The New Yorker. He wrote many books, actually, but he also wrote for The New Yorker. And this particular book, Let Your Mind Alone, is from 1935, so just keep that in mind. Okay, this first story is Pythagoras and the Ladder. It was in none other than the black, memorable year 1929 that the indefatigable Professor Walter B. Pitkin rose up with the announcement that, for the first time in the career of mankind, happiness is coming within the reach of millions of people. Happy living, he confidently asserted, could be attained by at least 6 or 7 people out of every 10. But he figured that not more than 1 person in 1,000 was actually attaining it. However, all the external conditions required for happy living was present, just waiting to be used. The only obstacle was a psychological one. So, figuring on a basis of 130 million population in this country and reducing the professor's estimates to round numbers, we find that in 1929, only 130,000 people were happy. But that between 78 million and 91 million could have been happy, leaving only 52 million at the outside doomed to discontent. The trouble with all the unhappy ones was that they didn't know themselves. They didn't understand the science of happiness. They had no technique of thinking. Professor Pitkin wrote a book on the subject. He is always writing a book on the subject. I have devoted myself to a careful study of as many of these books as a man of my unsteady eyesight and wandering attention could be expected to encompass. And I decided to write a series of articles of my own on the subject, examining what the success experts have to say and offering some ideas of my own. The basic one of which, I believe, is that man will be better off if he quits monkeying with his mind and just lets it alone. In this, the first of the series, I shall abandon Professor Pitkin to his percentages and his high hopes and consider the author of a bestseller published last summer. Let us plunge right into Dr. James L. Mersell's Streamline Your Mind and see what he has to contribute to the new happiness, as Professor Pitkin calls it. In Chapter 6, which is entitled Using What You've Got, Dr. Mersell deals with the problem of how to learn and how to make use of what you have learned. He believes, to begin with, that you should learn things by doing them, not just by reading up on them. In this connection, he presents the case of a young man who wanted to find out how to conduct a lady to a table in a restaurant. Although I have been gored by many a dilemma in my time, that particular problem doesn't happen to have been one of them. I must have just stumbled onto the way to conduct a lady to a table in a restaurant. I don't remember, as a young man, ever having given the matter much thought. I know that I frequently worried about how to depart from a table upon which you have left no tip. Dr. Mersell does not touch upon that difficult problem. I constantly find these mental authorities avoiding the larger issues in favor of something that seems comparatively trivial. The plight of Doctor's young man, for instance, is as nothing compared to my own plight one time in a restaurant in Columbus when I looked up to find my cousin Wilmer Thurber standing beside me, flecked with buttermilk and making a sound that was like something between the bay of a beagle and the cry of a large bird. I had been having lunch in the outer of one of 2 small rooms, which comprised a quiet basement restaurant known as the Hole in the Wall, opposite the State House grounds, a place much frequented by elderly clerks and lady librarians, in spite of its raffish name. Wilmer, it came out, was in the other room. Neither of us knew the other was there. The Hole in the Wall was perhaps the calmest restaurant I have ever known. The studious people who came there for lunch usually lunched alone. You rarely heard anyone talk. The aged proprietor of the place, because of some defect, spoke with a whisper, which added to the almost monasterial quiet of the place. It was upon this quiet that day that there fell suddenly the most unearthly sound I have ever heard. My back was to the inner room, and I was too disconcerted to look around. But from the astonished eyes of the people who sat in front of me facing the doorway to that room, I could tell that whatever it was had entered the room and was approaching my table. It wasn't until a cold hand was laid on mine that I looked up and beheld Wilmer, who, it came out, had swallowed a big gulp of buttermilk and was choking. Having so fortunately found me, he looked at me with wide, stricken eyes, and still making that extraordinary sound, a low canine hoo that rose to sort of like a high bird-like yeep. He pointed to the small of his back as to say, "Hit me." There I was, faced with a restaurant problem which Dr. Marcel does not consider. What I did finally, after an awful frozen moment, was to get up, dash from the place, without even paying my bill. I sent the whispering old man a check, but I never went back to his restaurant. Many of our mental authorities, most of whom are psychologists of one school or another, will say that my dreadful experience must have implanted in me a fear of restaurants. It did nothing of the sort. It simply implanted me a wariness of Wilmer. I never went into a restaurant after that without first making sure that this inveterate buttermilk drinker was not there. But let us get back to Dr. Marcel and his young man's peculiar quandary. I suppose this young man must have got to worrying about who went first, the lady or himself. These things, as we know, always work themselves out. If the young man doesn't work them out, the lady will. If she wants him to go first, she will say, "You go first." What I'm interested in here is not the correct procedure, but Dr. Marcel's advice to the young man in question. He writes, "Do not merely learn it in words. Try it over with your sister." In that second sentence, he reveals, it seems to me, what these inspirationalists so frequently reveal, a lack of understanding of people, namely brothers and sisters. 99 brothers out of 100 who were worrying about how to conduct a lady to a table in a restaurant would starve before they would go to their sisters and ask them how the thing is done. They would just as soon go to their mothers and have a good frank talk about sex. But let us, for the sake of argument, try Dr. Marcel's system. Sister, who is 21 and who goes around with a number of young men whom her brother frankly regards as pussycats, is sitting by the fire one evening reading André Gide or photoplay or something. Brother, who is 18, enters. "Where's Mom?" he asks. "How should I know?" she snaps. "Thought you might know that, stupid. You oughta know something," he snaps back. Sister continues to read, but she's obviously annoyed by the presence of her brother. He is chewing gum, making a strange cracking noise every fifth chew, and this gets on her nerves. "Why don't you spit out that damn gum?" she asks finally. "Ah, nuts," says her brother in a falsetto sing-song. "Nuts to you, baby, nuts." There's a long, tense silence. He rustles and rustles the evening paper. "Where's Itsy Bitsy Dicky tonight?" he asks. "Ditch you for a live gal?" By Itsy Bitsy Dicky, he refers to one Richard wore in a bow of his sister's, whom he considers a hollyhock. "Why didn't you go to hell?" asks his sister coldly. Brother reads the sports page and begins to whistle Horses, a song which has annoyed his sister since she was 10 and he was 7, and which he is whistling for that very reason. "Crazy over horses, 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 she's a little wild." Here we have, I think, a typical meeting between brother and sister. Now, out of it somehow, we are to arrive at a tableau vivant in which the brother asks the sister how to conduct a lady to a table in a restaurant. Let us attempt to work that out. "Oh, say, sis," the brother begins after a long pause. "Shut up, you lout," she says. "No, listen, I want to ask you a favor." He begins walking around the room, blushing. I've asked Greta Deering out to dinner tomorrow night, and I'm not sure how to get her to the table. I don't know how we'll both get to the table. Sorry. Come on out in the hall with me and we'll pretend this room is the restaurant. You show me how to get you over to the table in the corner. The note of falsity is so apparent in this that I need not carry out the embarrassing fiction any longer. Obviously, the young man is going to have to read up on the subject. Or what is much simpler, just take his girl to the restaurant. This acting out of things falls down of its own stuffiness. There is a curious tendency on the part of the how to live men to make things hard. It recurs time and again in the thought technique books. In this same chapter 6, there is a classic example of it. Dr. Murcell recounts the remarkable experience of a professor and his family who were faced with the necessity of re-roofing their country house. They decided, for some obscure reason, to do the work themselves, and they intended to order the materials from Sears Roebuck. The first thing, of course, was to find out how much roofing material they needed. Here, writes Dr. Murcell, they struck a snag. They didn't, he points out, have a ladder, and since the roof was too steep to climb, they were at their wits' end as to how they were going to go about measuring it. You and I have this problem solved already. We would get a ladder. But not, it wonderfully turns out, Dr. Murcell's professor and his family. For several days, writes Dr. Murcell, they were completely stumped. Nobody thought of getting a ladder. It is impossible to say how they would have solved their problem had not a guest come finally to visit them. The guest noticed that the angle formed by the two sides of the roof, which were equal in length, was a right angle. Let Dr. Murcell go on in his ecstatic way from here. An isosceles right-angled triangle with the base of known length. Had nobody ever been told that the sum of the squares on the two sides of a triangle was equal to the square of the hypotenuse? And couldn't anyone do a little arithmetic? How very simple! One could easily figure the measurements of the sides of the roof as the length of the house could be found without any climbing. And the area could be discovered, the theorem of Pythagoras used in place of a ladder. I think this places Dr. James Murcell for you. At any rate, it does for me. He is the man who would use the theorem of Pythagoras in place of a ladder. I keep wondering what would have happened if that guest hadn't turned up. Or if he had remembered the theorem of Pythagoras the way many people remember it, which is that the sum of the squares of the two sides of a right-angled triangle is equal to twice the sum of the hypotenuse, or some such other variant. Many a person doing a little arithmetic in this case would find himself with enough material on hand from Sears Roebuck to roof 7 houses. It seems to me that borrowing a ladder from next door or buying one from a hardware store is much simpler than waiting for someone to show up who knows the theorem of Pythagoras. Most people who show up at my house can't remember anything they learned in school except possibly the rule for compound Latin with dative verbs. My roof would never be fixed. It would rain in. Probably I'd have to sell the house at a great loss to somebody who has a ladder. With a ladder of my own and the old-fashioned technique of thinking, I could get the job done in no time. This seems to me to be the simplest way to live. Now I'm going to read just a little excerpt from The Case of the Laughing Butler. A lady who signs herself hostess wrote recently to Eleanor Ames, who clears up matters of etiquette for the distraught readers of the Daily News. How many cocktails should a hostess serve before a meal? Sometimes I feel so embarrassed because the dinner is ready, but the guests go right on drinking in the living room, and I can't find a tactful way to urge them out to dinner. I have no maid, so must announce dinner myself. To which Miss Ames replied, never serve more than 2 cocktails before dinner, for the guest who has several cocktails and an assortment of canapes and hors d'oeuvres will suffer a loss of appetite. Why not try a laughing imitation of a butler? Stand at the door and say in clear tones, dinner is served. If your manner is pleasant but pointed, and there are no more cocktails, your guests will follow you into the dining room. Here we have stated by hostess one of the problems of the American home today, and one which you and I, and in her heart of hearts, Miss Eames herself, No cannot be solved by imitating a butler. One might as well try to dispose of some such problem as what shall we do about sex by imitating a butler. To give a brief history of cocktails before dinner, every school child knows, of course, that the troubles began when liquor was substituted for tea as a late afternoon and early evening beverage. The old-fashioned tea party was easy to handle. Your Aunt Clara, your little niece could handle it and have the whole house in apple pie order before 6:30. Nobody ever drank more than 1 or 2 cups of tea, maybe 3 at the outset, and even if he did, it had no other effect than to make him slightly stupid. There was never any disposition on the part of tea drinkers to go on and on with the thing. Nobody ever crept into the guest room and lay down. Nobody shouted. I do not pretend that such things occur at all parties where cocktails are served, but what I mean to say is they never occurred at tea parties. The weakness of Miss Ames' attempt to cope with the cocktail problem, the proof of her uncertainty and lack of confidence in her own plan, lies in that curious suggestion of hers. Why not try a laughing imitation of a butler? If she had any faith in her ability to help hostess out, she would not have answered a hard question by asking another hard question. Let me answer that for hostess, who must be pretty bewildered. In the first place, if a hostess stands at the door and laughs, nobody is going to get the idea that she is imitating a butler for the simple reason that butlers do not laugh. You have to give an unsmiling and dignified imitation of butler, or the whole thing falls flat. Furthermore, it is extremely difficult for a woman in a dinner gown to imitate a butler. Moreover, a room of guests who have had only 2 cocktails are not going to be amused by or cater to anybody doing imitations of any kind whatsoever. To enjoy imitations, or even pay attention to imitations, people must have about 5 cocktails, at which point, of course, they will begin doing imitations themselves. But let us, for the sake of argument, consider Miss Ames' specific case, that of a hostess who, having served 2 cocktails and determining not to serve any more, stands at the door and gives a laughing imitation of a butler. Nothing beyond a few strained little laughs is going to happen. The hostess is simply going to stand there, her idiotic laughter dying, while a room full of people, each holding his empty glass rigidly before him, regard their hostess with cold grins. There's only one thing for hostess to do at this point, and I shall express it by paraphrasing one of Miss Ames' own sentences. If your manner is pleasant but pointed, and there are no more cocktails, you are going to have to make some more cocktails. This has become the accepted thing, and there's nothing to do but accept it. Dinner can always wait for one more round. Or if it can't, it is going to anyway.